Hello, my name's Robin Leafblad, and I'm here with Santa Ana College to bring you yet another installment of Pain and Torture. AKA, we're going to be talking about overexertion. We kind of titled it or given it an acronym PROMO. So looking at performance, what ultimately do we want our end goal of performance to look like? Recovery optimization, how we're recovering from all different aspects of our training, whether it be on the job or the calls themselves, or actually your fitness routine. And then mitigating overexertion, right? So, and what that kind of looks like is a little bit of a moving target. We're going to kind of talk about some things to consider and think about when designing your programs or executing your programs, and when we may need to adjust or change our focus a little bit. So the ultimate question is, how can you tell if you're overtraining, right? Right? There's tired, there's sweaty, but when we look at a training program on paper, depending upon what your shift schedule is, right? If you work 48-96, or you happen to be working at 96 and then resting for 48, right? That looks a little different. So if I gave you the same workout on day 1 of that 96, and I gave you the same workout on day 4 of that 96, right? We have to navigate how much harder is day 4 gonna feel with the same exact reps, same exact sets, same exact loads. Day 4 is going to feel a whole lot harder, right? So a lot of it is, how can we tell what are some of our signs and symptoms, or what cues should we be taking in as to how we feel when addressing whether or not we're overtraining or overreaching, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So always ask yourself, what are you doing and why, right? What's the intent? Am I doing it because it's written in my schedule, or am I really trying to accomplish something? And we may have to navigate based on that. So is what I'm programming for myself preparing me to be ready for the job, right? Is what I'm doing at 8 a.m. in the morning getting me in a better condition or situation to be effective throughout my day as a firefighter? Is it increasing my performance, right? Are there areas that I need to get better? Do I have a weakness? Do I have a shoulder injury, right? I'm working on my prehab before we get going on our calls. And then also longevity, right? A lot of times we can get really pigeonholed or narrow focused on what it is we're doing day to day, rather than kind of broadening that lens and stepping back, and overall in a 30-year career, how's what I'm doing daily going to benefit me in the long run? Really, we're all just trying to get to retirement and ride off into the sunset in one piece, right? So that's the main goal. What are you doing and why? So 2 classifications of overexertion really have to do with overreaching and overtraining, right? So there's something called a specific adaptation to implied demand, or the SAID principle, right? So if we want to get stronger, we have to stress the muscle. If I have weak bones and I'm worried about osteoporosis, I have to stress the bone in order for it to grow back and get stronger. So there is some amount of stress that needs to occur. And when we start to get fatigued, or we train 2-3 days in a row, and that 4th day is just really a reach or a stretch, right? That's more of our overreaching. What we're looking at happens after several consecutive days of hard training, right? If I worked at 48, I may not really tap into that overreaching, right? Once we get to 72, we start overreaching, and then we get to 96 and 120, and that's where we're into the overtraining, like that kind of kick over, that pivot point. So overreaching easily reversed with appropriate rest within a couple days, right? So a couple days, couple weeks, right? We push hard, we bring it back down, we recover, our body recovers and builds itself stronger, then we push again. Overtraining is where we kind of tip the scales into where the body's not able to come back, or come back as quickly. So happens when an athlete or firefighter, tactical athlete is what we consider you guys, ignores their signs, right? Hey, the same reps and sets are really difficult at the same 40 pounds, right? So I have to drop my weight to 30, right? If I'm having to regress or scale back because I'm not able to be as effective in the same type of training, then that would be a sign of overreaching. But I'm just going to keep pushing through based on how my schedule is. I'm not going to have time the next 2 days to train, so I'm just going to gut it out for 4 days in a row and train as hard as I can. So those types of things where we kind of go, I'm just going to white knuckle it and keep on going. When we ignore those signs that our body's telling us we need a little bit of a break, hey, give me just a half a day reprieve and we're good to go, that's when we're going to start to run into problems. Overtraining is going to increase the need for recovery to be longer. So recovery can require weeks or months. A lot of times where that tipping point is where those injuries start to kind of kick off. So healthy sleep, nutrition, mental wellness are all critical in preventing overtraining. So it's not just about what's my PT program look like. We have to broaden that lens and look at, hey, I'm on a 96. I'm also in a really heavy training block in my program. Also have twins who are under 3 at home and I'm not sleeping at home, right? So we have to kind of broaden that lens and look at what are all the things that are filling my cup, so to speak, right? So these must be part of the training regimen just as much as the exercise and the rest plan. We've got to kind of take all factors into consideration. So some signs and symptoms, right? The question is, hey, am I ignoring signs? But we need to know what they are. So signs and symptoms of overtraining. So we're going to look at a couple different kind of buckets or focuses, so to speak. So the first one's going to be training related signs. So when I give a training program or you're following a training program online, right? Like, are you doing heavy weights? Are you training for a marathon? Whatever that training program should look like. These are some things you want to pay attention to. So unusual muscle soreness after a workout. So especially if it's something that you've done before, right? Like 4x8, 4 sets of 800 repeats, normally you're fine. And for whatever reason, particularly this day, you're more sore after that same training routine. Inability to train or compete at a previously manageable level. So if I go back to that same 4x800 meters, normally my 800 meter repeats are about 2 minutes, right? So if it's like, if I can't hit that 2 minute mark or 3 minute mark or whatever that time is, if you are measuring when you train, right? I'm counting or I'm measuring with a stopwatch, then I will be able to tell, hey, you know what? If I do 50 burpees for time, generally takes me about 8 minutes, right? Today it took me 12 and a half. That would be an indicator, something that you have a baseline of is more difficult or is taking you longer to execute. Heavy leg muscles, even at lower exercise intensities. So just kind of feeling that heaviness or feeling like you have bricks on your feet, tight legs, heavy legs, that's kind of difficult other than you being able to know kind of how you normally feel to quantify. That's going to be kind of on you as the individual to kind of know what that feels like. Delays in recovery from training. So normally like, hey, I work 2 days, I train 2 days, take a day off, train 2 days, take a day off is your kind of regular routine. But we've increased your load, and so now we do 2 days, take a day off, and when we come back to that next 2 days of training, that first day back where you should be recovered isn't quite there yet, right? So if we're not able to fully recover back to that starting point, that may be something you want to take a little bit of a thought out of. Performance plateaus or declines, right? So as we stress the body, we will see a slight decline, but in recovery, we will then see that baseline actually increase. So if I'm training and training and training and training and my numbers are plateauing and I'm not getting better, and or after a period of time I'm actually seeing my weight or my times decrease, that's something to take into account as well. And then thoughts of skipping or cutting short a training session. So my best example I can give, I've worked with a lot of firefighters who've either got suckered into or thought it would be a good idea to train for a marathon or Ragnar race or some kind of long distance training scenario. And by the time, right, so if I'm going to train for a marathon, I am not a long distance person myself. I'm a sprinter, so that would take kind of, right, hey, this is going to be a 6 month to a year process. Once I get to the end of that training cycle, I'm really close to my competition, right? Let's say I'm going to train for the LA Marathon, right? That's lots of miles. For me, that'd be lots of miles. For some of you, maybe not so much. But as we get closer to that training, as we're a month out, we're going to be doing 20-mile days, right? We're going to be doing 18-mile days of training. And if you get to the point where, hey, do I really need to do the training, right? If you're trying to start talking yourself out of the work that you know you need to do, right? You're losing interest, there's not that drive as much. That's also an indication that we're overtraining, right? We're not finding the joy in the process and the value. And so it's like, 2 weeks out, this is what my program says. Do I really need to do it, right? I'll just make it through. So a lot of times we have to look at psychologically, how are we coming to those training programs as well? And if you're having more days where you're trying to just talk yourself into it, or you don't want to do the training that you know you need to, then you may need to take a little bit of a bigger break, step back, allow yourself some recovery, and then you'll come back to those training days a little bit more enthused and rejuvenated. Lifestyle-related symptoms. So these are going to be a little bit different. This is not so much focused on the X's and O's, so to speak, of the training program itself, but what else in your life is going on, right? So prolonged general fatigue, just feeling tired, more than normal, for example, and this could be not specifically to your training program, but your work schedule, right? So it's summertime, there's more injuries, there's more vacations, there's more forces, right? So a normal 48-96 schedule is now flipped and it's a 96-48. So if you worked a 96, had a day off, worked a 72, had 2 days off, had another 96, right? At the end of that stretch of 2 weeks, you're going to be a lot more fatigued than if you did your regular 48-96 multiple times in that same 2-week period, right? So prolonged general fatigue. Increased tension, depression, anger, and confusion, right? So if I'm working a whole lot of 96s with only a day or two off in between, probably going to be a little bit more frustrated, a little shorter tempered, whether it's at the station or at home, right? Has your spouse ever said, hey, you need to go back to work and adjust your attitude before you come back home? So when we start to snap, we seem more irritable than normal, right? These are all signs, lifestyle-wise, that we may need to find some recovery. The inability to bring it down. So you get home and your spouse is like, hey, you're running up here at the station, we need to bring it down here at home, right? We got to bring it down. We've got to try and find a way to unlock and unload and get those thought processes from whirling in the head so much. So inability to relax is another one. Poor quality sleep, right? So the more fatigued we get, actually the more restless we get in our sleep. And we'll talk a little bit more about sleep in a little bit. But generally, if you're like, hey, I had the ability to sleep a full 8 hours and I'm just not sleeping well, that fatigue also can kick into that lack of sleep. Lack of energy, decreased motivation again, and then moodiness, right? How you are when you come home after 96 versus how you are when you come home after 48. Probably, if we asked your spouse or your family, you probably have a little bit different persona when you get there. So, and then not feeling joy from things that once were enjoyable. So this kind of can kick into that depressive mindset. So these are all training and lifestyle related symptoms. Next, we're going to talk about health-related symptoms. So physiologically, what are we going to see besides just general fatigue and tiredness? Increase in occurrences of illnesses, right? So if you feel like you're getting sick more often, right? More colds, more flus, more general rundownness. Increased occurrences of illnesses is going to be one, especially if you're someone who doesn't normally get sick. Increased blood pressure and resting heart rate. So I highly recommend, right, we are all into these wearable technology devices. We've got iPhones, we've got Garmin, Fitbit, all kinds of different things. Whoop is a one, and the Oura Ring, both are really good at measuring sleep. So one of the things I highly recommend is actually measuring your resting heart rate. For a sleep lecture that we designed earlier, I spent the better part of a year measuring my sleep every night. And one of the options it gave me in the morning was to take my resting heart rate as soon as I woke up. So I highly recommend doing that. What I found for myself is that on average, my resting heart rate's about 47. plus or minus, right? Maybe 45, 49, 50, somewhere in there. But I noticed once I started getting into that overreaching, training a lot, right? Putting a greater load, not sleeping as much, burning the candle at both ends, right? I started to notice those as I was getting past that tipping point. My resting heart rate in the morning would actually be 55, 58, 62, right? So those is just a simple indicator as to, hey, if my resting heart rate was 62 when I woke up this morning, I probably need to make a better effort of hydrating or whatever I know I'm kind of missing, right? If I'm burning the candle at both ends, if my resting heart rate was 62, today's the day I need to like adequately make sure I'm getting good sleep tonight, right? Gotta shut the TV off, no binge watching Netflix, and actually get to bed. So if we're paying attention, we'll be able to see some of these triggers and flags earlier on. If we've got our head in the sand and we're just white knuckling life and just plowing through, then we're not gonna catch some of these things as early on. So resting heart rate's a really good indicator. If you know what yours is and you know what it's not, then you know kind of where you're at in terms of your recovery. For females, irregular menstrual cycles, missing periods, right? So disruption in hormone levels, and for gentlemen, we'll talk a little bit about that with testosterone and cortisol in a little bit. So lack of sleep definitely thrashes hormone levels and balances. So definitely something to look at. Weight loss and appetite loss, as well as constipation and diarrhea. So just general gut issues are going to show up the less recovery we're getting. So overtraining syndrome, right? It's considered a medical condition that occurs when an athlete doesn't adequately recover after repetitive intense training. So when we're looking at stress to the body, right, it could be physiological, it could be physical. There's different types of stress. We have eustress and distress, right? So just like we talked about earlier, that SAID or specific adaptation to imply demand, we have to imply a demand to the body. It's going to break down a little bit and then it's going to recover and come back stronger. That's eustress, right? Us being able to build resiliency and strength is a good stress. That tipping point in which we are not able to recover well, or we actually start to detrain, is what we call distress, right? So eustress is going to have exercise stress load plus rest. Our distress is going to be exercise stress load, non-training stress load, that could be work or home or both, and then life stressors and no rest, right? So sometimes we get to pick and choose when we can rest, sometimes we don't. But the times that we can pick and choose are the ones that we need to be really cognizant of. So basically fatigue is going to lead to declined performance, and then that, if we're not aware and we don't catch it, is going to then lead to potential injuries. So overtraining syndrome is viewed as the result of a training plan that wasn't balanced, okay? So exercise stress load, non-training stress load, as well as life stressors, right? We have to balance stress or rest in there in order to be able to recover well. So if we look at the appropriate training state at the top, right, we increase or add an overload or fit principle is what we kind of use, right, to get stronger, faster, fitter, is frequency, intensity, time, and type. So to prevent overtraining or overtraining syndrome, if you use the FIT principle to design your programs, and it can be even in conjunction with what your work schedule looks like, what your home schedule looks like, what's your frequency, right? In a 30-day period, is your frequency your normal 10 days a month, or are we at like 20 and 25 days a month, right? That's an increased frequency of work, right? If I normally am back squatting 250 pounds and I do that 1 day a week versus if I increase that same load to 3 days a week, that frequency is increasing, right? Intensity, right? Now, I may go from 10 days a month of work to 20 days a month, but all those extra 10 days are at the slowest station in the city, right? So the intensity, it's increased volume or frequency, but the intensity may actually be lower, right? So that's not going to be as big of a load as if I'm at a slow station for my normal shifts for 10, and then my extra 10 shifts are all at the busiest station that is up all night, right? So the intensity is how much load in the frequency given. And then time and type, right? So time is, are my workouts 3 hours long or are they 45 minutes? And type, is it super high intensity all the time or am I adding in recovery days? So frequency, intensity, time, and type are what we really want to look at overall in your life, but specifically with your training program itself. In that overload, we will get into those overreaching areas where our body gets tired, broken down, we give a rest day, and we're able to come back. When we're not allowing those rest days to happen is when we get into this overtraining and then the overtraining syndrome. So the biggest issue is the inflammatory response. So when we're training, right, we're going to have the body break down. When the body is broken, torn, right, we're tearing muscles, there's going to be an inflammatory response. One of the main things that we're looking at is the type of training we're doing. So in a like plyometric or powerful exercise, we have a concentric contraction where the muscle gets shorter, and then we have an eccentric contraction where the muscle is firing even though it's being lengthened, right? So generally, if you're someone who trains quite a bit, that eccentric load is what most people call negatives, right? Some of the benefits of eccentric loading, not only is it the counter of concentric, which if we're working on power output or explosiveness, we need both concentric and eccentric to balance out that, that explosiveness movement or power. But we also can do a couple different things with eccentric loads. So concentric, let's say I can curl 45-pound dumbbells. Awesome. I want to try and get to 50, but that 5-pound jump on a heavier dumbbell can be too much sometimes, right? Like I need a 47.5 instead of a 50 to actually get there. So I can't do 50s, but I can do 45s, and I can do 45s all day. So I may have a partner come in and actually assist me with those 50-pound dumbbells, and then I'm going to, under my own volition or my own power, resist them to the floor. And then they're going to help me back up, and then I'm going to resist them to the floor. So in an eccentric contraction, I'm actually stronger, right? I can hold weight more than I can concentrically contract it. So it helps me get that awareness or training with a heavier load than I can actually use on my own. It also is going to develop strength a whole lot quicker. And part of the reason for that is because we get a greater damage to the muscle through eccentric, or basically pulling apart those muscle fibers, than through concentric contraction. I kind of like think about it like Velcro. Eccentric's like the Velcro stuck together and we're trying to pull it apart, right? So if you've done negatives or eccentric loads, you will know firsthand that you will definitely be way more sore with eccentric loads than you will with concentric. Benefit, faster, stronger, handle more weight, allows us to get our hands on weight that we haven't been able to control, but you definitely will be way more sore. So in that, we're looking at eccentric muscle action, generally mechanical injury, right? I have a muscle strain that can increase inflammatory response. Concentric muscle contraction is basically just being sore from the training itself. And then joint action, repetitive motion, right? So getting in and out of the rig the same way, right? 40 times a day times 20 years. These things can all lead to inflammatory responses, right? So we have to look at what was happening to drive an inflammatory response, which then can drive overtraining issues. So what we're looking at is adaptive microtraumas, right? That's part of training. We're going to get these microtraumas, and as we recover or rest, we should recover from those microtraumas. Beginning, let's say I do a negative training program, I get some micro tears, I'm sore, right? That's local acute inflammation. I'm just going to be sore in the area that I worked. if I continue to train and I'm not allowing my body to recover, that inflammation can kind of grow or spread, right? So now, instead of the muscle just being sore, now the tendon gets irritated and angry, and now I have tendinitis, and then my elbow's mad, right? If you've ever kind of felt injuries navigate or travel along the body, this is kind of what happens. If we maintain a level of local inflammation, that's going to get to a broader inflammation, which then gets to a systemic inflammation. And so what we're looking at is as pro-inflammatory cytokines increase, it mostly affects our IL-1s and our IL-6s. So this is all hormone response. Generally, all of this will stimulate oxidative stress, right? So, right, that's why we all take antioxidants or have darker colored berries or greener, foliage that we eat. We're all looking for antioxidant type foods, right? So if we're doing all this over here in our nutrition to be, antioxidant, and then we're barreling ourselves down the tunnel with no rest in sight and increasing our oxidative stress or load, we're kind of not really helping out the system. So we have to look at how we're training on top of how we're eating, on top of how we're recovering, to look at how we're recovering and allowing that oxidative stress to dissipate. So as that oxidative stress increases, we're actually getting a deterioration of vascular function. So continuous prolonged inflammatory processes have a huge impact cardiovascularly on the body. That's already kind of a trigger point when we talk about firefighting, right? Number one killer of firefighters, especially post-retirement, is cardiovascular or issue, heart disease, heart attacks, and so forth, right? So if we look at, it's not just necessarily dietary, but it's the progressive stress and overload over a 30-year career is what really is the greatest detriment to that heart function. So it increases deterioration of vascular function, atherosclerosis, and also heart failure. So, right, we've got to see the big picture in order to make better choices in the here and the now as to what we're doing with our inflammatory process. So health complications from overtraining, endocrine imbalances. So this, we're kind of circling back to these hormone issues. So a lot of questions we've been getting with departments as of late is having low testosterone, right? We are getting a lot of people that want to get their testosterone checked. Very often it's not necessarily the testosterone that's low due to fatigue and stress and overtraining and use, but it's the cortisol that's increased, right? So as stress and inflammation increases, cortisol is released. We're also looking at a more of a shift work mindset, right? So shift work being working graveyards, working swing shift, day to day, that could be any and all of you, right? So you don't get to pick and choose what sleep you get when you're at work or how much of it you get. But if you're up at night, your cortisol levels are elevated when they should be depressed. So the main issue isn't necessarily low or high testosterone, it's the ratio of cortisol to testosterone level that is really the big driving factor into fatigue. So when that ratio is off, it's going to produce alterations in your reproductive system. For females, like we talked about, amenorrhea, or it's going to massively mess up your menstrual cycles as well. And then ultimately adrenal fatigue, right? So all of these hormones are playing off of each other. Increased cortisol, we're going to look at decreased adrenals. So adrenal fatigue is probably something you've heard of before. What is it, and is it technically real, right? So we have a link on here from Hopkins Medicine if you want to check that out. But basically adrenal fatigue is kind of defined, or the theory suggests that it's prolonged exposure to stress, right, higher stress loads that could drain the adrenals, leading to a low cortisol state. So it's not officially a medical diagnosis, but, and there's no formal criteria to define or diagnose adrenal fatigue. And most, at least from a hospital-based perspective, anyone who's telling you like, we'll measure your adrenals and all this stuff, they're basically going to say that it's unreliable methods of diagnostic testing, okay? But the symptoms are real, right? Again, we're dealing with a prolonged state of stress and inflammation and overload, so we will have brain fog, low energy, depressive moods, salt and sweet cravings. Sound like anybody at 2 a.m. after 3 calls after midnight? I don't know. Lightheadedness and other vague symptoms, right? So these are real. These are things that, especially if you're on a 96 and you've been at the busy station for all 4 shifts, you're definitely going to be dealing with some of these things, right? Adrenal insufficiency is a technical diagnosis. It is a known condition, although it's very rare, right? So rare to be low on testosterone. It's rare to be like thyroid. A lot of times when you're dealing with thyroid levels, very rare to be outside of normal, because normal is a pretty broad range. So the adrenal insufficiency, like, it's going to be very rare that someone's going to be diagnosed with this, but it doesn't mean that we're not straining them, doesn't mean that we're not in these inflammatory elevated states. So signs and symptoms are going to be fatigue, body aches, unexplained weight loss, low blood pressure, lightheadedness, a lot of very similar to the adrenal fatigue theories, loss of body hair, and skin discoloration. So generally, the biggest issue with this is more going to be like a medical diagnosis, right? Like, I have a brain tumor on my adrenal gland, right? Those are going to be extreme cases where we're going to see some pretty extreme, right? Fatigue, body aches, and lightheadedness, pretty low level, I guess, symptoms. But if we're looking at losing weight, losing hair, and skin discoloration, then we've got some issues. So adrenal hormone is cortisol, right? So unfortunately, with the schedule of a firefighter, right, your cortisol is high when it should be low, and it's low when it should be high. So cortisol is released during stress, none of which any of you have, I'm sure. Controls our sleep and our wake cycle, right? So cortisol really is a main driver in that circadian rhythm, right? So communicates from the central nervous system, peripheral tissues about the circadian rhythm. So misalignment of that central clock, right? You spend 4 days messing up your central clock, and then you go home and try and get it all back in order, which you maybe just barely get back in order, and then you come back to work to mess it all up again. So again, if we look at like law enforcement, a lot of times swing or graveyards, I mean, it's not a great shift cortisol-wise. Like, you're going to have elevated levels of cortisol, but it's consistent, right? So it's not changing. Unfortunately, with firefighting, you may be up at 2, you may not be up at 2, right? So because it's constantly in flux, that's actually harder on the body. Cortisol and sleep share the same regulatory pathway. So when we're talking a lot about sleep and having better sleep based on whatever sleep you are getting, right, we have to really understand that cortisol plays a huge part in that sleep. Even if it's like, hey, I'm at home, got 10 hours to sleep, and I still slept poorly. So we have to understand that cortisol is a direct influencer to sleep, and they use the same regulatory pathway. So when excess or low cortisol disrupts the pathway, your sleep's going to be disrupted. So a basic inverse or a graph of how those things work together, right? Your cortisol is going to be at its lowest in the morning. It's going to be at its peak between 6 and 12 during the day, and then it's going to start to cut back down, right? If we look at the inverse of what's happening with heart rate and blood pressure, right, we're going to see a direct correlation between cortisol and those two physiological conditions. So one of the main complications or extreme end of fatigue and increased stress and inflammation is going to be a more acute situation called rhabdomyolysis. It's a complication from overexertion. So we keep just pushing those signs and symptoms to the back seat. Just keep going, just keep going. Generally, there's 2 kind of classes of firefighters that this ends up being the biggest problem for. Number 1 is usually our new firefighters coming in who may not quite be at the fitness level we need them to be at, and we're trying to get them to that fitness quick, right? If there's a big gap between where I'm at and where I need to be, right, I may not be prepared, or my body may not physiologically be ready for that adjustment. The second kind of pool of firefighter that is more susceptible to this is the firefighter that I usually put in my middle 10 category. I have an early 10 category, a middle 10 category, and a late 10 category in terms of years of service, right? So the early 10 is usually just the gym and the job. That's all you got to worry about, right? 2-3 hours at the gym, go to work, loving life, I'm a firefighter, this is great. Middle 10, you've got 3 kids under 5, you've got 2 rental properties, you're trying to promote to engineer or captain, and you're at the busy station. So, right, like insert all life problems and things, spin all the balls, and you don't have time for training or fitness. So as that fitness decreases in that 10-year window, at some point, most of us come full circle and go, hey, I need to get back in shape. But what we remember being able to do was what we did 5, 6, 8 years ago, right? So we are no longer at the same shape we were when we stopped training, but when we go back to training, we try and dive right back into where we left off. So again, taking too long of a hiatus and then trying to start right back at 250 on my back squat, or 2-minute sprints for 800 meters, right? You're definitely going to feel that difference. So rhabdomyolysis is skeletal muscle that's being damaged and breaks down rapidly. Breakdown products are released into the bloodstream. The most critical one being myoglobin from protein myoglobin, which can harm the kidneys and also lead to kidney failure. So a lot of times, one of the main signs and symptoms is like Coca-Cola colored urine, right? The kidneys are in a really bad situation if your urine is that dark in color, right? So causes generally crush injuries, right? So extreme and catastrophic muscle damage, strenuous exercise, especially that you're not conditioned for, medications, drug use and abuse, and infections, right? So again, this is where we get back to what I called the moving target at the beginning of this lecture. It's not all or nothing. It's not, you can't use it medications, or you can't take, you can't drink. You can't, if you're sick, you're gonna get rhabdomyolysis. It's not all or nothing. It's kind of the perfect storm, usually is what happens, right? So most of our strenuous exercise that's going to contribute to rhabdomyolysis is what's going to be more high intensity exercise. Remember, we talked about eccentric loading being more detrimental or catastrophic to the muscle, right? So plyometric or high intensity exercises are huge in terms of using eccentric loads, right? So if I'm not used to eccentric loads, or I'm not used to plyometric, or I drastically increase the level of intensity in which I'm doing them, that can set me up to be in that condition. Repetitive movements, so something's over and over and over and over, and then eccentric muscle action like we talked about. And then this is one that usually is what shows up in the fire service the most, right? Under normal circumstances, the person would have been fine. But we happen to be doing a 4-hour drill and turnouts cutting holes on a roof for practice in 105-degree weather, right? So as the weather can drastically shift or switch, we're not ready for it. We're behind the curve with our hydration and nutrition. And so when we're getting into those heat stress situations that are past our ability to recover, that's when we're setting ourselves up for rhabdo. So these are all kind of check the box, check the box, check the box, and it's like, oh yeah, that's how we ended up with rhabdo. That's how we ended up here. Doesn't mean if you have 1 or 2 that you will get rhabdo, which is kind of what we call it for short. But these are all things to think about and consider. Again, why we need to take a broader lens picture as to what's going on in life when we're really thinking about what our training looks like. Severity of the symptoms are going to be muscle pain, vomiting, bloody urine, or what we talked about earlier, Coca-Cola colored urine, really, really dark urine. Confusion depends on extent of muscle damage, right? So as we're training, right, under normal circumstances, this firefighter might have been fine, but we happened to be training extra long because we had a probationary, or it was 80 for the last 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden it's 105. We happened to be out and running all over doing a bunch of calls, and we didn't get a chance to get water, or whatever. So usually it's not a isolated incident, it's a accumulation of a bunch of different things that can lead to this situation. Exercise-induced or exertional rhabdomyolysis is relatively rare. Again, you kind of have to paint the perfect picture, set the stage with specific situations in order to end up in this scenario. Oftentimes, things like butterfly pull-ups, GHD sit-ups, right? Those kind of hit the high-intensity, repetitive, eccentric muscle action. They kind of hit all those check boxes, right? So if I haven't done a whole bunch of pull-ups in a long time, and then I try and go and do 4 sets of 25 and wonder why my lats are swollen out to here, right? That could be something that would set the stage for this type of condition. So how do you know if you have rhabdo, right? Extremely sore or weak muscles for more days than normal, right? So if I'm normally, right, I know myself, if I train really hard, I'm going to be sore within 48 hours, and it usually will last a day. Now, if I'm sore right after the workout, or 2 hours after the workout, or even the next day, I know that I'm at a more fatigued state, right? If I get sore more quickly, or I stay sore longer, I know that I'm in a position where I need to actually focus a little bit more on my recovery. You should also look out for muscles that are swelling, like I said, right? Did a whole bunch of pull-ups, I haven't done them in a long time, and now my lats are like weirdly out to here, right? So if you have a specific muscle area that's excessively swollen, and then dark urine, those are some really, really critical signs you want to look for. Definitely see your doctor right away, get in, get hydrated, and hopefully we haven't got too far down the road. So preventing rhabdomyolysis, we want to start an exercise program slowly. So if you're getting back into it, if you're coming back to your fitness, right, you got to check the ego at the door, baby steps, start getting back to it slowly. Listen to your body. Your body's going to tell you where it's at, right? If you're staying sore, you're getting sore super fast, hey, it was a little too much, I need to dial it back. If you feel especially sore or tired during the workout, stop and rest, right? Especially on duty, right? We've got to work smart, not hard when we're training on duty. Your training shouldn't fatigue you to the point to where you wouldn't be able to go on a call, right? So it's important to understand appropriate intensities and levels while training on duty, as opposed to if I'm training off duty. I'm not going to work on like 1 rep maxes while I'm at work. Those are things that should be reserved or saved for off-duty scenarios. Staying hydrated, avoiding getting overheated. So that's partially being aware of what weather changes are going to be taking place. And then taking breaks in the shade, right? And some of this has to do with supervisory awareness and conditions, right? So as a supervisor, you may be more fit than someone on your crew. But when you're setting up scenarios where it's randomly hot out of nowhere, we have to do this training, right? People are starting to get beet red in the face. Like, it's not an ego thing. It's a, hey, I need to keep my crew safe. We need to start, like, hey, guys, let's take 5, let's take 10, let's get out of our turnouts, right? Being smart in terms of how we push our people as well is important. Alcohol, drugs, right? We're all going to tell you not to drink alcohol, don't take drugs, right? Nancy Reagan said so. But something to consider or think about, and this happened to me when I was in college. I got, I think it was like an ear infection or a sinus infection, and was put on antibiotics. I was playing collegiate soccer at the time. Doctor didn't say anything. Regular hydration, regular training, but I ended up getting a double quad strain because antibiotics actually dehydrates you. So a lot of times, and I had told my doctor, hey, I play on the soccer team. This is the type of training we do. And she's like, okay, here's your antibiotics, bye, right? Didn't really give me any information other than that. I didn't think to ask. Now every time I get medication, I'm like, hey, does this dehydrate me? Are there any, considerations I need to take? Because if you're on a medication, you go to work in an otherwise normal situation, but you're on medication that's dehydrating you, it's the small stuff that we don't always like correlate or connect together. So I know we always say don't drink and don't do drugs, but it could be a scenario where, hey, I need this, medication for something specific, but the contraindications or the things that the side effects that it could be giving me may set me up for other issues based on my training and the fact that you're firefighters. Talk to your doctor about medications you're taking, right? So when prescribed things, ask questions. How is this going to affect me? Try and explain what you do and lack of sleep you get and how your job affects you physiologically. So could that, be more intense of a side effect for you as a firefighter as opposed to someone in the general population? And then you may have increased risks if you have uncontrolled diabetes, sickle cell anemia, thyroid disorders, muscular dystrophy. So these are all other things that would increase the chances of rhabdo. So overtraining interventions and treatment, right? Rule out other things, right? Why am I sick? Why am I sore? Why am I tired? We got to rule out some other stuff, and then we've got to start looking at our training program. Recovery and rest do not need to be totally inactive, right? We have active recovery. It's a good way to flush the system and flush a lot of those toxins out of the body. No definitive marker to indicate overtraining as opposed to overreaching, or improved performance may be one marker to indicate recovery, right? So as I am improving in how I perform, that should be kind of like, hey, I'm on the upswing, so I should be able to go back to regular activity. Resuming training must be gradual. Again, if you haven't trained in a while and you're jumping back in, take your time to get back into it. And then obviously prevention is the best treatment. Ultimately, all of this comes back down to balance, right? How are we balancing home life? How are we balancing work life? How are we balancing our training, our nutrition, our sleep, right? All of this stuff plays together in terms of preventing that overtraining scenario. So we're going to talk really briefly about some ideas or things you want to think about when designing your own programming. Principles and considerations for exercise programs. So department member training versus a recruit, right? So again, we talked about rhabdo and overexertion kind of falling into these two categories. So I'm going to start with the department members first, right? Pay attention to, think about what is your training. I'm going to start this new training program and it's July, right? Well, July in most fire services means a lot of people are off and there's a whole lot of overtime, whether you want it or not, right? You may be getting forced or you may be picking overtime up. Think about what your training volume looks like in conjunction with your actual work schedule, right? Generally, most workouts are like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I like when I work out or write programs for firefighters, I like to set it up as kind of a playlist style. So I'll design 4 workouts that you can get done in your week, right? I may work with a department that has a 4896 schedule. I may work with a department that has 3s and 4s. Or you may have 4896, but that's not ever actually the schedule you work because of forces and overtimes. So you have to take, hey, in a week or a tour, these are the 4 workouts I need to try and get done. Then you can look and go, okay, well, I'm at the slow station that day, so my heavier day could be here, right? You can pick and choose where you preload those training sessions. So being able to be flexible with your program so that it matches up with what your external load in job and home life looks like is one thing you want to pay attention to. Role, position, and rank, right? As a firefighter, I may have more time for training. As a captain, as an engineer, that time starts to dwindle. If you're a BC, definitely dwindles, and you don't have working 40-hour work week versus working 56. You may not have that set time in the day, right? You have to be more intentional about carving out the time. So, or sometimes you may have your routine as a firefighter, and then you promote to engineer or captain. Now suddenly your routine's totally different. How do you still get what you were doing in your training before? How do you weave that into what your new responsibilities are, right? So as we change or move up in rank, sometimes our focus has to be a little bit more flexible in those program designs. And then I know some firefighters that get all their workouts at home because they're at the busiest station and they always get interrupted, so the consistency is not at work. For some folks, home life is crazy. They got 3 kids under 5, right? You got extra life responsibilities that are going on. And so the only way to really get consistent training workouts is going to be on duty. Some are going to be in the middle, right? So it's not a all or none situation, but we have to look at, again, what is our, right? If my daughter's playing travel softball and she's in all-stars for the next 3 months, and all my days off are going to be focused on that, then I may need to really focus on trying to narrow in and get my training done on duty, right? So we've got to kind of look at all the pieces and go, okay, how can I design this effectively? Where are you training, right? If you're training at the station, what equipment do you have? You may have been at, station 1 with this huge gym that has all the equipment, and you're maybe at station 4 that's like a broom closet to work out in and has a squat rack and a tire, right? So we have to be creative in terms of what you have access to and knowing, hey, my regular training schedule, I'm at station 1, I have a lot of equipment to use, but this in my playlist of 4 workouts, I have the one that I'm going to have to do at station 4. So which of these 4 workouts would best be successful being done at station 4, right? So it takes a little bit more masterminding or planning or flexibility to really line up a program that's going to kind of fit all these needs. That's part of where we come into play. That's what we do, right? And sometimes it's like, this is the way I've always trained for the last 20 years. This is what I've done. And now I have all these new sets of criteria or influences that I have to navigate around, and I don't know how to get done what I need to get done. So we can come in and go, what do you have? Where are you training? What time do you have? And then help you write a program that's going to really focus in on the goals you have. So definitely give us a call if that's something you'd like assistance with. And then job specificity versus hobbies and interests, right? I highly recommend focusing most of your training time on what we call your wheelhouse. Being a firefighter is what pays the bills, right? If I'm like the second in the world in masters triathlons, that's awesome, but that doesn't pay the bills, right? So if I only train on my triathlon stuff, I'm going to have, in this wheelhouse, I'm going to have one long spoke that's cardio. But I may not be effective in tactical movement, lateral movement, strength, rotation, and that's going to set me up for injuries. Now, if I focus on my wheelhouse, I have a very developed and balanced program, then I can add my extra days in focusing on that distance training, right? So again, highly recommend focusing on your wheelhouse for job specificity first, and then adding in the secondary things that you like to do outside of that. The other bucket or side of this equation is going to be recruits or probationaries, right? So definitely extra level of stress in life at these places in time. What's the level of conditioning prior to coming into an academy or prior to probation? Does it align with activities in the classroom, right? So days that you're not drilling, then my PT can be harder. If I'm drilling, then maybe my PT needs to be more recovery focused because we're going to do 4 hours of pulling hose with my crew, right? So we need to be mindful of what are we doing and then where are we placing the effort and the emphasis. And then recovery practices, right? There's a lot of unwritten rules as probationaries, right? First one up, last one to bed. But what are we doing on our nights off, our weekends, right? Are you partying with your friends, or are we getting massages and, getting Epsom salt baths and ice baths? Are you taking active measures to recover from the heavier load of training that you're dealing with? And then being aware of either pre-existing or new injuries and not kind of white knuckling and pushing through them, but addressing those and finding the appropriate recovery so that we don't have those injuries. So this is kind of an example, right? We talked about all those pieces to consider when designing a program. And so now we're going to look at not the outside influences or factors, but what actually are we picking, right? Most often, when I talk to firefighters, they're like, yes, we finally got in the weight room. We didn't get calls. All right, I got a buddy. We're going to jump in the weight room. And they're like, what do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? What do you want to bench? Okay. Right? So it kind of is like this picture from the Jungle Book, the two buzzards that are like, I don't know. What do you want to do? Right? So then it's just kind of like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. The other thing you have to think about is also, usually the conversation is, oh, is it a cardio day or is it a strength training day? We'll go with cardio. Okay, right? So again, having a laid out idea of what you want to do, that way you're hitting all the things you need to target. So obviously strength is a component, cardio is a component, but some other specific things for firefighting or being a tactical athlete that are important to consider: mobility and flexibility, right? If I can't move well, I'm going to get injured. Power, agility, plyometrics, right? We need power output, or we need core to extremity movement. Again, allows us the least amount of opportunity to get injured. And then specialty needs, right? I particularly have a shoulder injury, or you particularly have a knee injury. That way, like, hey, my warm-up may be different than your warm-up because I'm working on my shoulder and you're working on your knee. So those are areas to consider for training. Again, if that seems like overwhelming and a lot, we can come out and help you kind of design or put the pieces together to kind of target each of those areas. Fitness readiness to consider, right? Am I off duty? Am I on duty? Am I going to work tomorrow? Am I going off, right? So am I working at 24, 48, 72, 96? Just like I talked about, I could give you a template workout on day 1 of a 96 and give you the exact same load and intensity and workout on day 4 of a 96, and I guarantee day 4 is going to feel like 20% harder, right? So again, it has to do with how much did I sleep last night, what number shift am I on, right? All those things to take into account. And then daily expectations. Are we drilling? Are we training? Family and personal responsibilities for days off. So this is a sample schedule. This would be a days off. So this would be a 3-4 schedule. So 48-96 would kind of be a little bit different. But this is kind of that playlist of 7 days of work, right? So day 1's going to be rest. Obviously, the ones in blue are going to be off duty. So these are going to be either my heavier weight days, right? If I'm trying to really move a lot of weight and I don't want it to impact me for calls later on in the day, that's going to be something I'm going to do off duty. If I'm working on, I am a champion Ironman or stand-up paddleboarder, right? And I need longer distance. I need my 2 hours of running. Obviously not going to happen on duty. So those are where you're going to have to kind of pinpoint those into your day off training. So we have a rest day coming off from work, right? Especially if we were in more of the 72 or 96. That's not the day you're going to work out. That's the day where we're going to have to really focus on the recovery and the rest. Day 2, heavy weights. Day 3, longer cardio. Day 4, again, going into that rest period before we go back to work. Now on duty, we recommend more of those shorter, higher intensity interval training type workouts like Tabata, any type of interval that has a work and a rest scenario. Agility, plyos, or medium cardio, right? And then things that are more tactically focused like single arm, single leg, right? We can get a really good strength adaptation with single arm and single leg movements without having to do an excessive amount of load, right? So again, preventing injuries going into your regular training and drill or call scenario. So align to your training day schedule. Again, day 1 rest. So this kind of breaks it down a little bit more. So that previous 7-day, now we're going to break down what does heavyweight day look like, what does longer cardio, HIIT, etc. look like. So this would be some examples, right? So generally when I program workouts, I tend to do an upper body segment, a lower body segment, a total body segment, and a core segment. This allows me to get a really balanced look at my program. When I'm looking at upper body, I have 4 different buckets of exercises I can pull from, right? I have horizontal, push and pull. I have vertical, push and pull. So when I pick an upper body exercise, like in this scenario, we picked flat dumbbell press. That would be a horizontal press. Now, if I did these 4 movements together and then moved on to these 4 movements, if I did horizontal press, I'd want to pick something opposite of that. So in the next variation, we picked a pull-up, which would be a vertical pull, right? So being aware of making sure we're changing our approach to fitness or the exercise choice so that we're getting a balanced push-pull, vertical and horizontal is beneficial. For the lower body, we have either hip dominant, which would be more of our like deadlifting motions, anything that's involving the hamstrings and the glute, or more posteriorly focused, as opposed to knee dominant movements, which tends to be more of our squats or quad dominant focus, okay? So if I look at this scenario, I did a hip dominant movement as deadlift, as opposed to a knee dominant movement, which would be lunging or squatting. Total body is a way to integrate elevated heart rate without having to do cardio, so to speak, right? So a lot of different total body movements. Again, we tend to overprogram anterior, so when we're thinking about total body movements, most of them show up in mountain climbers, planks, right? A lot of that kind of thing, burpees. Everybody loves them. Nobody loves them. Everybody hates them, actually. But everybody picks them when we do this program. So total body, our Olympic lifts like power cleans, those would be things that you can use. I highly recommend always trying to add in some type of kettlebell swing, right? The kettlebell swing is violent hip extension or good power output. It's hamstrings, glutes, low back, and posterior shoulder, so 100% posterior, and then also elevating that heart rate. So it's a great posterior total body exercise. And then the last station, you can either do core or cardio, right? So if I have a rower, if I have an assault bike, I can put that in here. Or if I need to work more on my core, I can put in planks, crunches, all kinds of variations of those. So you can use this as core or cardio. We also talked about rotation and lateral movement. So with our total body or core, it's a really easy way to get in that rotation or lateral movement. So if I wanted to get in a lateral movement, I have lateral planks for my core. I have Russian twist for rotation. I could make my lunge a lateral movement, right? So there's a lot of things. I can look at what I have and then how do I add in lateral movement? How do I add in rotation? And then longer cardio and rest. On duty, similar scenario or similar way to design the program. We have upper, lower, total, and cardio. So on upper, we did bent over barbell row. That would be our pull. The opposite movement, we did overhead press, right? We did single leg deadlifts for our lower body, trying to work towards that single arm, single leg. And then step up and laterally, right? So I'm gonna step up laterally, similar to how I get in and out of the rig. Thrusters and burpees, both terrible choices, but everybody loves to put them in their program. And then battle ropes would be a good cardio piece as opposed to bike, row, or ski. Day 6 is going to be our agility, plyos, and medium cardio. So 400 or 500 meter repeats, whether that be on a track, on a rower, on the bike. Again, dumbbell overhead press, dumbbell bent over row. Notice that everything is single arm, single leg, or with dumbbells as opposed to a barbell. Single leg box step-ups, single leg dumbbell good mornings, battle ropes again, single arm snatch, and then core front planks, and then lateral planks. So hopefully this gives you kind of we had to look at what's our life look like, and then what type of training do we want to do, And then where are we doing the training, off duty or on duty? And then we have to decide if it's balanced front to back, right to left, lateral rotation, strength and cardio based. So the last piece we're going to talk about today is the importance of nutrition on that recovery, right? So I'm not going to get too far in the weeds on intermittent fasting, keto, seafood, I eat it, whatever your nutrition plan is. Just know that as firefighters, especially if you're increasing your training and or you're at a busy station, right? It's important that you have carbohydrates. So dominant fuel source of intense exercise or intensities over 65% of VO2 max is going to be carbohydrate, okay? Highly important the more intense our exercise gets. Utilization of muscle glycogen is directly related to exercise intensity. So if you look at fatigue, we'll look at it in a second, right? Our total energy decreases as our fat usage decreases as our intensity increases. Our carbohydrate use increases as our intensity increases. Hydration as well, right? Our acuity, our effectiveness, our sharpness in performance decreases exponentially the more dehydrated we get. Again, number one, we want to be effective. Number two, extreme situations like rhabdo are important to be paying attention to. So I know we always hit hydration pretty hard with the nutrition piece, but it is highly effective, especially for performance. So as we get dehydrated, we're going to see a very sharp decrease in performance as well. For the most part, right, we want to be like 1 to 3 in terms of hydration. Increased body weight loss, so especially for heavy training loads, if you're on probation, if you have recruits, it's important that you have them weigh themselves in the morning and weigh themselves in the evening. So extreme weight loss in a period of 24 hours through training generally is a really perfect storm to set yourselves up for heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and also rhabdo. So thirst, increased thirst, impatience, decreased blood volume, right? 1 through 3 is kind of like we can handle that. 4 through 7 is going to be more around that heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And then 8 through 11 is going to be where we start getting into that rhabdomyolysis situation. So things to, kind of be aware of and think about. Feel like you're like, I can't remember what pump pressure I'm supposed to have, whatever. It's like there's a lot of things. Something as simple as hydration can start affecting that thought process. So a few tips for hydration. Number one, easiest thing to think about on a general average day, half your body weight in ounces of water, right? I weigh 160 pounds. My general baseline should be about 80 ounces of water. Now, number one, if I'm not paying attention, if I don't have a set volume, right, like a Nalgene bottle or a hydro flask that's a specific amount of ounces, if I'm not paying attention to how many I'm drinking, I don't know if I'm hitting the target, right? If I only look at how my urine color is, right, I'm going to be behind the 8 ball once my urine color is too dark to really be effective at catching up on that hydration. So half your body weight in ounces of water to start. Now, if it's randomly 104 when it's been 80, probably should increase that water. If I'm increasing my training, I'm going to be in turnouts all day because we're doing drills. Those are all other things to consider as well. For the rig itself, make sure you keep your ice chest topped off. Most often, fire rigs have water, whether it be individual bottles of water or an igloo with water that you guys can get. So drink early, drink often. Watch out for lightheadedness, headaches, dark urine. Generally, you want about 8 ounces for every 20 minutes of activity. And then, like, I know with the nutrition portion, we talk a lot about easy things to think about. So like protein is 4 ounces, about the size of your palm, or about the size of a deck of cards. 1 cup of rice or grain or vegetables is about the size of your fist. So about an ounce of fluid is about a mouthful of water, right? So it should give you like, hey, if I have to drink 80 ounces, I need 80 mouthfuls. If you want to think about it that way. So better hydration means better performance. Obviously, drink. So the biggest issue most people have in terms of my conversation why they don't drink water is no one wants to pee every 20 minutes, right? Especially when you're on a call and you don't have the luxury of doing so. So some things to think about, right? Just like I can only absorb so much protein at a time, I can only absorb so much water or liquid at a time. So I can pour a gallon of water into a sponge without spilling a drop. How do you think I do that? I have to pour very slowly, right? We pour, we saturate the sponge and then let it dry, and then saturate the sponge and then let it dry. So over a period of 24 hours, I could probably pour a gallon into a sponge without spilling any, right? So you have to think about that. So think about constantly sipping. I do really well if I have a water bottle that has hash marks, because then I'm like, oh, I'm behind, I'm ahead. Like I can see where I'm at in terms of where I need to be. If it's a solid colored, I had a hydro flask, obviously like solid metal. I'd drag that thing around with me all over and not actually drink it, right? My water's with me, but I don't see where I'm at in terms of my process, so I don't think to actually drink it. So everybody's a little different. I found that I need something clear that I can see through to know how far I am behind or ahead. So may be more helpful for you to have something that has hash marks or a way to measure what you're drinking. Or if you have a hydro flask, know you have to get through 3 of them in the day, which means I have to be through 1 by like 10 a.m. And then by my second one should be like 2 p.m. And then my third one should be before I go to bed, right? So if you have a volume or amount you know you need to hit, you kind of should have check marks in your day as to whether you're getting it or not. So some do's and don'ts, right? Continue to hydrate during and after exercise, drink during meals. Oftentimes at night, our body, right, so the cravings, going back to the salt and the sugar cravings, oftentimes our craving is actually a need for water or hydration. So our body can't determine or differentiate between hunger and thirst. So at night, generally, we tend to gravitate to food. Excuse me. As opposed to drinking water. So start with drinking water first and then move to the food part if you're still hungry. And then things not to do. So don't rely solely on water. Obviously foods, watermelon, fruits, vegetables have water in them. Don't delay in drinking. Don't overdrink. Again, sip through the day as you go. And then some other things to think about are dietary intake like salt and sugar, right? So those can drastically affect your hydration as well. And then, right, on both sides of the equation, don't hesitate. If someone doesn't look right, something doesn't feel right, someone isn't feeling well, right, speak up and say something so that we don't get too far down the road in terms of someone being in a bad situation hydration-wise. Last piece of advice, 4 R's of recovery, right? So recovery is really critical to this overtraining scenario. We want to replenish, repair, reinforce, and rehydrate. So replenish muscle glycogen, carbohydrates stored in the muscle following a training session, right? As we end our training session, whether it be physically working in the weight room or it be out on the drill ground in turnouts, we want a 3-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein, right? If you think about it this way, a lot of you or the ones that I have worked with, hey, I want to get this training program. I feel like I'm losing muscle mass, like I want to keep my muscle mass or gain more muscle mass. The biggest issue, right, the training helps build the muscle fiber, right? Carbohydrate helps protect the muscle fiber. If I don't have carbohydrate, then my muscles don't have anything to use, and so they then pull from themselves or their own musculature. You cannibalize yourself, basically. So you spend all this time in the weight room to get big, get swole, get strong, and if you're not eating carbs, then you're basically negating all of the work you're doing. So 3 to 1 carb to protein ratio, so 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate post-workout. If you generally do a protein shake at the end of your workout, have milk, have a banana blended in it, even oats, right? So have some type of carbohydrate with that protein. Repair is the protein conversation. So we want to regenerate the muscle with high quality protein, again aiming for 15 to 30 grams of protein. We really can't metabolize more than 30 to 40 at a time. So if you're taking in 60 grams of protein, you're going to be wasting half of it at least. So 3 to 1, 30 to 15, or 60 to 30, that would be a 2 to 1, or 15 to 60, that would be a 3 to 1. So more carbohydrate, less protein for post-workouts is ideal. Reinforce, so muscle cells, immune function, central nervous system, and function with colorful and antioxidant, right? We talked about the oxidative stress of the body. We want antioxidant-rich foods. Easiest way to do this is to eat the colors of the rainbow, right? The darker the berry, the greener the leaf, the better off you are. But try and get something from the red and orange and yellow, something from the green, something from the purple, something from the white, right? Bell peppers are a really easy way to cover most of those. But onions, garlic, mushrooms, right? Eggplant, like squash, zucchini, right? If you have young kids, it's a really fun activity. Pick a color a day and then, hey, let's all research our favorite fruit and vegetable in this color. The benefit of that is you find out what's in season, then you don't spend as much, right? I'm not going to get spaghetti squash in April because it's not in season and it's heavy, but I will get it in the end of the summer or into the fall, right? Spaghetti squash is super inexpensive when it's in season and it's yellow, right? So some things to think about. 3 to 1 carb to protein ratio post-workout, eat the colors of the rainbow. Really important, vitally, to have grains, fish, nuts, and oils, right? So oils lubricate those joints and decrease that inflammatory response. And then hydration, half your body weight in ounces of water. So when is recovery nutrition most important, right? If our training session is abnormally higher than normal, heavier lifting sessions, competitive scenarios, right? Consecutive days of competition and or training, right? So if it's a normally work 48s and now I'm on 96, rest one day 96, right? That's going to be where nutrition is at a higher importance. Or if you're training multiple days in a row, right? Or multiple times in a day. So let's say I did my actual PT training in the morning and then we went and drilled with our rookie in the afternoon, right? That's basically a 2 a day. So important to kind of collectively look at what your day looks like as to how important and what nutrition is going into the body. Recovery is continuous. While the body may be most responsive to nutrients in the first 1 to 2 hours after exercise, continuing to deliver right nutrients the next up to 2 days fully enhances the training response. So obviously it's not just the now, it's collectively before and collectively after that training scenario that can be affected as well. So real easy recovery snack ideas, some proteins, mostly meats and cheeses, some nuts and seeds and oils, right? This is going to be your 15 to 20 gram range, 20 to 25 gram range. Going to be more of your meats. We've got some lentils, edamame, yogurt, and so forth. And then our carbohydrates options, 15 to 30 grams or 45 to 60 grams, mostly are grains and fruits and vegetables. Chocolate milk's probably the easiest and the most old school post-recovery drink you can do. Good balance of carbohydrates and proteins. Some other supplements that would be helpful for recovery and generally helping in sleep and stress reduction would be zinc and magnesium and B6, as well as ashwagandha balancing the whole system. So these are areas that will help decrease stress and increase, hopefully, the ability to sleep. ultimately, recovery is necessary. You have to look at, most firefighters I know tend to be really good compartmentalizers, right? Like, this is my training scenario, this is my work scenario, this is my home scenario. No matter how many different categories you have, you only have one cup. And you have all these things that are filling this cup, right? And if you're constantly, or all things you're dumping from you to cups, right? So if I dump to my training, dump to work, dump to home, there's only so much capacity I'm going to have to give. You cannot pour from an empty cup. So you must give yourself time to replenish and recover. Hopefully this helps you guys think about some tactics and strategies on how you can recover better. You don't always get to pick and choose what days you work, how much you're gone from your family. But hopefully in the time that the things you don't get to control, you can at least make wiser and better choices to have it impact you less. Thanks for your time, and I hope you have a great day.